All right, Wellness Nations. Today on the Wellness Cafe podcast, we have Dr. Mario Newport with us from Florida. Welcome, Doc.
Well, hi there. How are you, Jonathan?
I am well, and thanks again for your time to come on the show. And we met briefly at the Keto Academy conference, basically a conference about the ketogenic diet, the benefits of being in ketosis, and the benefits of the uses of exogenous ketones, which we'll talk all about that in the show. And it's been a great pleasure to get to reconnect with you again.
Yeah, this is great.
Awesome. For our audience out there who don't know who you are, why don't we kind of start with your story and how you got involved with ketones and, most importantly, coconut oil?
Yeah. Well, that was really an unexpected path in my life. And basically, I'm a physician. I'm a neonatologist. So I spent 30 years practicing in newborn intensive care units, taking care of sick and premature newborns. And my husband, Steve, was the accountant for my practice. And he decided to stay home so he could take care of our children. So he worked from home. He's one of the original guys that worked from home, I would say,
That's
to
awesome.
take care of kids, original Mr. Mom. So he made it possible for me to be a mother and a physician. So really awesome guy, great guy, very creative, very active, wasn't, very overweight. I mean, a little bit, maybe, not much. And but physically active and very, he could do anything. He worked on computers all day. He created very letter perfect forms and this type of thing. So when he was only 51, he began having some problems with his memory, and he started making payroll errors, procrastinating on getting quarterly tax returns done, which should have taken 20 minutes, and missing deadlines and this type of thing. And it became concerning. And then he began forgetting if he had been to the bank and the post office. And at that point, I thought that is really strange because he was only 2 years older than me. And I thought, that was part of his job to go by the post office, pick up payments from patients and this kind of thing.
Right.
And he misplaced the mail, and he couldn't remember if he'd even been to the post office. So that was very concerning and alarming, really. And so he saw a neuropsychiatrist, and the doctor said, well, he noticed he was depressed, and he felt that depression could explain his memory problems. And however, over the next couple of years, it became more obvious. We moved from so that I could open another newborn intensive care unit. We moved an hour north of where we lived at that point, and he was completely confused, and this was unlike him. I mean, he could follow his nose to find anything, and now he couldn't read a map. He couldn't figure out where we were, even though it was a very small town. And he just he started spending endless hours in the garage looking for something. He would spend hours, and I'd come home at the end of a workday, leaving him in the garage in the morning, and he'd still be there looking for it, and he couldn't remember what it was even. It was just very unusual behavior, and thought, well, things really seem to be getting worse. So got him to a specialist who dealt with Alzheimer's patients, and he was tested, and he had an MRI and blood work and everything, and he had this test called the mini mental status exam, and it was 23 out of 30 points is what he got. 30 points. It's a very easy test. So if you're normal, you get 30 points, and he scored only 23 points, and that was like eye-opening. And the doctor said, well, he has some type of dementia. I'm not sure if it's Alzheimer's. We'll see if it progresses. And 6 months later, he was worse. And so the doctor said, I believe he believed he had Alzheimer's disease, and started him on Alzheimer's medications. And we got a second opinion from the Bird Institute at University of South Florida, and they agreed he had Alzheimer's. And so that was, as you can imagine, very devastating news for myself and our family, and for Steve. I mean, he was well aware of what he could do and what he could no longer do, and the problems he was having. And that really explained his depression. Who wouldn't be depressed if you knew
Right.
your mind was slipping at such a young age? And so it just continued to get worse. And by 2006, he couldn't do any more accounting. He was driving. It was getting a little iffy at that point. But he ended up 3 hours away on the other coast of Florida one night when he should have been pulling in the driveway. And it's like, holy cow, what happened? And he said, well, he had missed a turn. He was supposed to be following my daughter, and he missed a turn. And he said, I just couldn't get over to get off the exits to turn around. And it's like, what? Luckily, he still remembered how to use his cell phone. So it was quite an ordeal. I mean, it was the next morning before he actually got back home. He ended up having to stop in a hotel when it got dark, and it was an ordeal. So he had to stop driving. And at that point, he couldn't even remember how to turn his calculator on, even though his computer, couldn't remember how to use his calculator, couldn't turn on his computer. He'd been on a computer for hours every day, either working on it or playing on it. And it was just mind-blowing, to see how he was deteriorating. And, then he developed physical symptoms, tremors. And when he would talk, his jaw would tremor, and he had trouble finishing a sentence, and his hand would tremor when he tried to eat. And, he just seemed to be on a downward spiral. And we couldn't get him into any clinical trials, for a while there.
Right. It seems to be progressively getting worse very fast too, right?
Yeah, pretty fast. And when you look at Alzheimer's disease, the average lifespan is about 7 years from diagnosis. So this was happening. So he was 51 when the symptoms started, and 56 when he had stopped driving. And so by 2008, so 8 years into having symptoms, finally along came a couple clinical trials. And, he had had such a, worsening over the previous year. Like he couldn't, when we tried doing gardening, he was our gardener. He couldn't remember if he was digging the hole, taking the dirt out, or putting it back in. I mean, he was so confused, short-term memory, so poor. But along came a couple of clinical trials. And this time he actually qualified for them. He looked like he was going to meet the criteria. So I scheduled him 2 days in a row to have 2 different screenings for these clinical trials, hoping he'd get into one of them. Or if he got into both, and then we would have to choose. You can't be in 2 at the same time. So the night before, I was on the internet, and I'm looking at the risks and the benefits of these 2 drugs. And I just, by chance, one of them happened to be in a press release about new potential treatments for Alzheimer's. And in the press release was news about a medical food that was working towards FDA recognition. They weren't there yet. They were still about a year away. But they had done some clinical trials in which they found that nearly half of the people with Alzheimer's had improved memory and cognition when they took this medical food. They didn't say what it was or what it did. So naturally, yeah. And you don't hear that ever about Alzheimer's drugs. They never claim that they improve memory or cognition. Maybe that they slow the disease down for 6 months. That's the best you can expect from these drugs. So I found free patents online, a website, and I was able to look at the patent for this medical food. It was called AC1202 at that point, and now it's called Axona. It did eventually get recognition a year later. And for the first time, I started learning about the concept of Alzheimer's as diabetes of the brain. So in Alzheimer's, there's a problem with insulin deficiency and insulin resistance in certain areas of the brain. And this is true in some other neurodegenerative diseases too, like Parkinson's disease and ALS and multiple sclerosis and even autism. There are PET scans looking at glucose uptake that show decreased glucose uptake in the areas of the brain that are affected. So they had the idea of using ketones as an alternative fuel for the brain, an alternative fuel to glucose. And where this idea came from, really, I believe, was Dr. Richard Veach at the NIH, he's a MD, PhD, physician biochemist. And he worked with Hans Krebs when they were working out the Krebs cycle. I mean, he worked in his lab. He was a student in his lab, and And then he went on to the NIH, and he had been studying ketones for, really almost a couple decades at this point, that this was happening. And in 2000, they published some research in which they looked at cultures of neurons that were either subjected to a toxin that causes Alzheimer's or a toxin that causes Parkinson's. And to some of these cultures, they added the ketone body, beta-hydroxybutyrate. Some of the cultures they did not. And what they found was that there were many more surviving neurons in the cultures that had beta-hydroxybutyrate, the ketone in the mix. So they published a paper suggesting that beta-hydroxybutyrate appears to be neuroprotective. And so this was in 2000. And then they wrote several other hypothesis papers, shortly thereafter that were published, and about ketones as an alternative fuel for Alzheimer's and a number of other diseases that have this problem of glucose uptake. So also in 2000, the medical food company, they had the brilliant idea that possibly medium chain triglyceride oil could benefit people with Alzheimer's by virtue of what was known about it was that when you consume medium chain triglyceride oil, your liver converts part of it to ketones. So here we are, ketones as an alternative fuel. And the crazy thing is, if I was a layperson or even a physician in another area, I might not have even known what MCT oil was. Medium chain triglyceride oil is called MCT oil for short. But as a neonatologist, we used it in our practice in the newborn ICU. We used to add it to the feedings of our very tiny babies. We're talking the ones that 2 pounds and under. We would add it to every feeding to supplement their feeding, and they absorbed it very well, and they would grow faster. So I knew what it was, and I thought, wow, we use it in the hospital. It must be available, but I wasn't sure. I didn't really know you could get it online, which you can. But one thing that stood out in there that I didn't know about it was that it was extracted usually from coconut oil and sometimes from palm kernel oil, which are both very rich in medium chain triglycerides. So I thought, I wonder if coconut oil could possibly help Steve. And, I'm reading about this at, it's 1 a.m. in the morning, and the first screening is set up for 9 a.m. So I didn't have time to go out and do anything about that, so we went for the first screening. And the crazy thing is we had a day before and a day after testing because of the 2 days in a row. It was just amazing, the timing and everything. And so we went for the screening, and it was very disappointing because he needed to get at least 16 out of 30 points on that mini mental status exam, and he only got 14 points. And so he didn't qualify. And we're like, finally he can qualify for a study. There's one available, and he doesn't qualify. It was devastating. And the doctor said, well, she wanted to test him a little more, and she had him draw a clock, which is a standard test for Alzheimer's. And what he drew were just a few little circles and a few numbers. Very random, very disorganized. And she told me that he was on the verge of severe Alzheimer's. And so on the way home, I thought, what do we have to lose? I'm going to go buy some coconut oil. And, up to that point, I was under the misconception that coconut oil is bad for your heart. There's a myth out there, that coconut oil is the artery clogging fat. And that was actually perpetuated by the makers of Crisco, who had the real artery clogging fat, trans fats. Anyway, so I thought, well, he's dying of Alzheimer's disease, even say down the road he might have a heart attack from it. Let's go ahead and try this. So picked up the coconut oil, brought it home, and then I got back on the internet and I started looking at reminding myself freshman biochemistry 101 from medical school. What are the medium chain triglycerides? And I found that they're triglycerides are basically chains of carbon atoms that have hydrogen, mostly hydrogen and some oxygen attached to them. And the medium chains are 6 to 12 carbons long. Some people say 8 to 10, and those are the makers of it. That's what they extract from coconut oil to make MCT oil. But it has C6 to C12, or other people consider the medium chains because of the properties of these fats. And so then I was able to find on the USDA website a fatty acid composition of coconut oil, and I learned that it's almost 60% of these medium chain triglycerides, C6 to C12. So I calculated how much coconut oil I would need to give Steve to equal 20 grams of this medical food, which is what they were using in their study. And it turned out to be 35 grams, which is a little over 2 tablespoons. So,
So you connected the dots. Let's just let me just break this up for a second. You were online. You found that, hey, there's a headline that says this medical food can help with Alzheimer's, and then you realize that they're talking about ketone bodies. And then you realize that, oh yeah, MCT oils get converted into ketone bodies, and you were asking, okay, what has MCT oil? And it becomes apparent that coconut oil does have MCT oil. Wow.
Yeah, I know. Kind of incredible. And again, if I wasn't a neonatologist, having used MCT oil, I probably wouldn't have even known that it was possible. And, you know, bodybuilders have been using it for decades. And people who want to lose weight, there are studies in Japan and other places that you don't accumulate fat when you eat medium chain triglycerides like you do with possibly other fats. So, you know, it's been on the shelf actually for decades, available, just not widely known, much less that it might help Alzheimer's. So, so the next morning, he was scheduled for 1 p.m. for this study. So that worked out really well too, because what I did was I gave him a little over 2 tablespoons of coconut oil and oatmeal. And because coconut oil at the temperatures in our kitchens here in the USA is usually a solid, and it has to be melted. And so we put it in oatmeal, and he ate it, and I ate the equivalent amount. And I don't have a gallbladder, so the first time I ate it, I got major indigestion. But fortunately, he had no problem with it. You know, I've definitely adapted to it since then. Just had to go up a little more slowly. But so about 3 hours later, we're heading to Tampa. This time it was a different place. It was a different center that was doing this study. And the day before, he couldn't remember the season, the day of the week, what city he was in, which was St. Petersburg instead of Tampa, what floor he was on in the building. Those were 4 of the things that he couldn't remember. So this day, they took him away to do the test, and he didn't think he had done very well, but they start taking his blood and doing his blood pressure. And I said, what's going on? And they said, oh, he didn't tell you he scored 18 out of 30 and he qualified for the study. So he gained 4 points. And he remembered today, the season, the day of the week, what floor he was on, and what city he was in. Those were the 4 things that he gained points on. And I was just blown away, because even on the way down, he couldn't remember the season. You know, he couldn't pull that out. And coconut oil, the ketones from it peak at about 3 hours after you take it, at least in Steve, you know, when we measured them. So the timing was like, wow, it was kicking in right about the time we got there for the test. Isn't that crazy?
Right.
Yeah. So, you know, so he qualified, and then I thought, well, I don't know if it's really the coconut oil or was it just really good luck? You know, what was it? So, but I thought, you know, we're going to keep this going. Mm-hmm. It made complete scientific sense to me. The basis for it made sense. So the next day, I mean, I just started adding a little over 2 tablespoons every day in the morning. But then I got every recipe and coconut cooking book I can get my hands on. And pretty much right away, you know, I thought if a little bit of ketone is going to help, why would you just limit it to 1 dose a day? Why would you just do this once a day when your brain needs ketones 24/7? So started cooking with it, adding it to other meals. We started eating coconut flakes, coconut milk, everything coconut. And, you know, coconut is great, I think. You know, some people don't like it. I don't know what's wrong with them, but I love it, and Steve loved it too. So it was great. I mean, we just started substituting it for other fats. And then we also saw that he started cutting way back on carbs too, just naturally, not interested in the tons of fruits he was eating and breads and pastas and rice. He would just leave that on his plate. But what we saw, like over the next few days, was really dramatic. First, he scored higher on that test. Then he just started being much more active and more talkative in the morning. completing sentences, started whistling again and making jokes. And, he said he felt like the light bulb was turned on in his head. The light switch came on in his head the day he started coconut oil. And within really a few days, he felt like he had hope for his future. And, his depression lifted very quickly. And we looked at each other by the fourth or fifth day and said, wow, our life has changed for the better. It's like, now what do we do with this information? So I started, I was in the meantime researching everything I could get my hands on about, coconut oil, medium chain triglycerides, ketones, all of this. And one of the names I happened upon was Dr. Richard Veach that I mentioned earlier, who had been studying ketones. He's considered one of the world's experts on ketones. And so I found his information in Wikipedia, and I called him, and he actually answered the phone himself. And I told him who I was. I didn't tell him right away what happened with Steve. I just asked him, theoretically, do you think somebody with Alzheimer's could improve with the ketones from coconut oil? And he said, no. The levels would never be high enough. And he said that the people with the medical food had asked him that, like several years earlier, and he said, no, the levels wouldn't be high enough. You need much higher levels. And he's been developing a ketone ester all this time that really can get levels 10, 20 times higher than what you can get from MCT oil. I mean, very quickly, and this is beta hydroxybutyrate, which we'll talk about more later.
Right.
Yeah. So then, 2 weeks after Steve started the coconut oil, he drew another clock. And this time it had a full circle. All the numbers were in the right order around the clock. And it had a whole bunch of spokes in it. It was weird, like he had a bazillion hands of the clock in there. But I think he was trying to line the numbers up across from each other or something. It was just a marked improvement, much more organized. And so I faxed the 2 clocks to Dr. Veach. And he called me right away, and he said, wow, this is unexpected and amazing. And so he started sending me his papers, the work that they had done on ketones and his hypothesis papers. And he put me in touch with some amazing people. I didn't know who they were right at that point, but now I'm in awe of who they are. They're pioneers in ketone research. Dr. George Cahill, who discovered that the brain during starvation, up to 60% of the energy is supplied by ketones, as long as you have fat, burning fat, and then Dr. Theodore Van Italy called me. He and Dr. Sammy Hashem, who also called me, were the ones who discovered that when you consume MCT oil, part of it's converted to ketones. So it was mind-blowing, to get to talk to these people.
Wow.
Yeah.
What a ride. So did you at that point notice Steve's condition start to get better and better?
Yeah. So
Awesome.
So basically, over about a 9-month period, 9 to 10 months, we just saw steady improvement. And some of the other things, like right away, the tremors went away. He would have sometimes a little bit of a hand tremor in the morning before he had his coconut oil. 20 or 30 minutes later, it was gone. He started finishing his sentences. He had a weird gait before he started the coconut oil. He couldn't run anymore, and it was slow. He'd pick his feet up extra high, and it was weird. That completely normalized by between about 2 and 3 months. And he had stopped reading, and he couldn't really explain why. He was an avid reader. He was constantly reading novels, and had stopped reading. And around 3 or 4 months after we started the coconut oil, he said, oh, I can read again. And I said, oh, why couldn't you read before, and why can you read now? And he said, well, the words on the page were just jumping around. They were in little pixels, he said, and they were like jumping around on the page. And he said, and that stopped. Now I can read. But he had comprehension issues at that point. However, his memory just seemed to improve and improve. And at about 9 or 10 months, his comprehension and his memory of what he had read earlier was improving. He would talk about things that happened, like a volcanic eruption 2 or 3 weeks earlier, and he'd say something, wow, the sunset must be more beautiful today because of that volcanic eruption, a few weeks ago. And I'm like, what? He couldn't even remember if he was taking dirt out of the hole or putting it back in, And then I had a doctor appointment, and he was sitting in the waiting room one day, and a few hours later he said, while I was in the waiting room, I read an article in Scientific American about Einstein, and he told me about the article, certain details in it, and I'm like, how in the world did you remember that? I mean, it was incredible. So, he really continued to improve during that first year, and then he leveled off.
Right.
But so much better, and he actually got into one of those studies. He actually got qualified eventually for both of them. And then we did get to choose. And neither of them turned out good. We found out he took, it was an oral medication that was supposed to reduce amyloid plaque in the brain and keep more from building up. And he was on the placebo, we found out later, for 12 to 14 months. They wouldn't tell us the exact date. It was a crossover trial. So eventually you would get on the drug, and that's one reason we chose that study. So then he did switch over to the drug, and he was on it for probably 5 to 7 months, and he started having all kinds of weird side effects from it, wounds that wouldn't heal, and he'd nick himself shaving and would bleed for several days. It was really strange. And then he fainted, and he also, right around that time, started having some memory problems and some worsening of his Alzheimer's. And it's like, no, this was about 2 years after he started coconut oil. And we ended up stopping the drug because of the side effects, getting him out of the study. And then we later learned, a few months later, we got a call that they had stopped the study because this drug caused accelerated worsening of Alzheimer's.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So the irony is coconut oil got him into the study only to be in a drug study where the drug potentially made him worse. And I think that is what happened at that point. He just started doing some weird things like putting his clothes on backwards. And I would have to talk him through a shower. It was an awful thing in Alzheimer's. People just literally forget how to do things. And that's how he described it. He couldn't remember how to do things. And so I'd have to tell him, okay, put the shampoo in your hair, now rub it in, now rinse it out, and just the whole shower like that. I'd have to talk him through it, and shaving. Oh, God.
Right.
Yeah. So Dr. Veach came to the rescue. And all this time, he's only been able to make a small amount in his lab, enough for maybe one person. So he had finished toxicity testing and all that. And he said, well, why don't we do a little pilot study of one person? He sent it for Steve. To take.
Wonderful. That
talk
is
about
ketone esters?
The ketone ester. Right. So it's beta hydroxybutyrate linked to butanediol. And this makes an ester that you can't just take beta hydroxybutyrate unattached to something because it's too acidic. It would burn a hole in your stomach.
Right.
So for it to be absorbed and not do that, it has to be attached to something. So in this case, it's attached to butanediol to make an ester. It tastes like jet fuel. It tastes really bad. So we had to work on, making it palatable. And, so I tried many different things. But anyway, so he was able to finally drink it. And he started with a dose that was probably half overall of what Dr. Veach felt somebody with Alzheimer's needed, but he just couldn't make enough, But in spite of that, the very first dose was amazing. I've got a videotape of a couple hours of before and after taking it, and Steve became euphoric. He felt great. He, for the first time in quite a while, he was able to recite the alphabet and write it all down, and it took him 20 minutes to write it down before he finally got the whole thing all the way through the alphabet. Can you imagine not being able to write anything? He was ecstatic. And the thing that impressed me the most was somebody with Alzheimer's, their attention span is not normally 20 minutes to work on something like that, but he did it. And he was just blown away, that he could do that. And then like over the next 24 hours, everything turned around. He could start doing these things. I mean, suddenly he could take a shower again and shave and pick out the right clothes and put them on the right, not backwards and upside down. And, he just continued to progress. It undid almost everything, that had happened as he had gotten worse. So this is profound. And, we measured his ketone levels and to figure out what dose, that was something that was really not well known in people. And So Dr. Beach, we sent to his lab, and then we got a precision extra eventually, where you can do just a tiny drop of blood and test it yourself at home. But we found that if he took between like 25 and 30 grams of the ketone ester, that he could get his levels up to about 5 millimoles fairly easily, 4 to 5 millimoles, which is amazing.
That's the measurement of the ketones in your blood, by the way.
Right, the measure of the ketones. And if you're taking MCT or coconut oil without a ketogenic diet, you might get to like 0.5 mLs. Sorry, 0.5 millimoles.
Right.
So 5 millimoles, 10 times higher. And that's just one dose. So it was extraordinary, and it was actually written up. We did it's been published in Alzheimer's and Dementia Journal, and I got to be the lead author with Dr. Van Italy and Dr. Veach and some others from his lab, and rather amazing to be published with them. But Steve's case report of the medium chain triglycerides and then his response to the ketone ester, and so that's a peer-reviewed journal. I'm very proud of that. So, basically, Steve, it held him for another 20 months before he had a next major setback. And eventually what happened, he did lose his battle with Alzheimer's. He started having seizures, and he had never had seizures before. And he was standing. He said he loved me, hugged me when I was leaving for work, and I had a caregiver with him, fortunately. He was not on his own at that point. And she called me 5 minutes later, and she said she had called EMS and was doing CPR. And I'm like, oh my God. He fell straight over backwards, hit his head, went into a seizure that lasted 20 minutes. And when I got home, he was still blue, and the EMS was just getting there. And he had another seizure on the way to the hospital. And there was no stroke, nothing like that, to account for it on his scans. And we really don't know why he started having seizures, but the first one was a doozy, and he had a brain injury with it. I mean, he hit his head, and he was really he couldn't even walk the first 2 or 3 days, after that happened. And so from that point on, he became dependent. He had been able to do things, pretty independently with some assistance, but at that point he became dependent, and then he did lose his battle in January of 2016.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah. So, but I feel like we got at least 3 good extra years that were better than the year before we started coconut oil, and out of ketones as an alternative fuel for the brain, amazing.
Absolutely. And it's seems like it's rejuvenated the brain, like reconnecting the neurons and really,
yes,
revivify his life.
Yeah. It didn't just stop it. He actually reversed tremendously. I mean, and so, I started giving talks. Well, first about 2 weeks after, when he drew the clock, and Dr. Beach, was amazed and started sending me all, this literature, I thought, I've got the secret that, there are 5 million people in the U.S. with it. There are 35 million people worldwide that have it. And the numbers are expected to triple by the year 2050. I mean, it's a horrible, devastating illness. And it's not just Alzheimer's, it's these other neurodegenerative diseases too, and autism and those types of things, people that could benefit from this. And so I was really overwhelmed. I really felt like I was living in an alternative universe where I knew a secret and nobody else knew it. And I had to get this message out. And so I started writing to people. The first person I wrote to was Sandra Day O'Connor, the Chief Justice, who's retired. Her husband had Alzheimer's, and she was part of the Alzheimer's study group. And so I wrote to her. And my approach was, there's a medical food that's going to be coming out. And it's simply, I explained what it was, MCT oil that's available on the shelf. You can get it as MCT oil, as I learned, and or coconut oil. And why should people have to wait another year or however long it takes for this to come out? You need to get your scientists on this urgently, your medical people, to look at this, look at the science, and it's on the shelf. Let people know, there have been these studies, these clinical trials that they did so far. And I got no response. I sent to media people. I sent to politicians. It was 2008, and uh, I sent it to all the major, the candidates who were up for presidential election. I sent it to so many people, CNN, Fox News, everybody,
Right.
and no response from anybody. And I was, I was just like, what? Nobody's hearing this. And so then there was an Alzheimer's Association conference in June of 2008. So this is 2 months after. And what I did was I wrote up my own little case study, not for a journal, but for the public. And there are 5,000 researchers at this conference. It was in Chicago. And I contacted them. I requested a table. I sent them a copy of what I wanted to pass out there. They approved it. They took the money. And then we made all the arrangements to go. And then 3 days before, they email me and they say, we've reviewed your request and we have decided to decline it. They wouldn't let me pass it out.
So what's the next step?
It was awful. Well, I went anyway, and we slipped a few to people here and there. My sister and her husband came, and Steve, And so then it just was a grassroots thing. I went to local health food stores, and we sent it out on the internet to everybody who might be interested. And then, I developed a website, for information that's been up since right around early 2009.
Is that when you wrote the book too?
So I started writing the book. It took 16 months to write it.
Right.
And it's amazing, how much research goes into a book like that. You have to study it. You have to read it carefully, read full articles, not just abstracts, really is what you need to do. And then I had to write it. I wrote it in such a way that the public could understand it, but doctors wouldn't be offended by it. They need references. They want studies. So
I actually read that book, by the way, when I was in chiropractic school. In fact, that's when I stumbled upon your work and by a mentor of mine, Dr. Dan Murphy, and that's when I learned about the paleo diet and really the low carb and how wheat is bad, and that just changes my paradigm.
Right. And this changed ours.
Yeah. 09.
This changed ours too. We had already adopted a whole food diet, but we still had whole grains and a lot of that kind of thing. And just, over time, Steve just, like I said, he dropped the sugars, the fruits and the pasta, the rice, the bread. I didn't even put it on his plate anymore. So, and we upped and upped and upped the coconut and MCT oil. And he was really on a ketogenic diet. I lost weight. We both did really well with it, and it's just a really great lifestyle, I think.
Right.
Just so many potential benefits from ketones, and
we'll shift gear here. I mean, how do you feel now that I think the ketogenic diets? It started with paleo, low carb, and then now the ketogenic diet. With a lot of people start to talk more and more about this high fat, low carb, low protein, and high quality fat diet.
High quality fat.
Yes, and you're essentially seeing the movement of people striving to be better and start to really make important changes in their diets and lifestyle and start to see their brains improve, their health improve. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, it is. And really the ketogenic diet wasn't called that for a long time, but it was for epilepsy. There's a classic ketogenic diet that's been used for 90 plus years.
Let's break it down for our audience. What is ketogenic diet?
Okay, a ketogenic diet is it's basically any diet that will help increase ketone levels. But the classic ketogenic diet, where the idea came from, was first developed for childhood epilepsy, and this was 1921. There was a pediatrician that found that a very high fat diet, we're talking 80-90% of the calories is fat, extremely low carb, and just enough protein to help a child grow, that a child with seizures, about a fourth of them will completely stop having seizures, and another 50% of them will have a big reduction in their seizures, maybe by 50 to 90%. So, and the reason, and that this diet mimics starvation in that you know would break down fat, and starvation fasting was actually used to treat epilepsy. And also type 1 diabetes. It was really before insulin. It was the only alternative. And so, you know, there were just mentions of it, like in the Bible and in the Middle Ages, in certain, literature, there was mention of fasting as a treatment for epilepsy. So this worked really well, and I'm not sure that they knew it was from ketones right away, but eventually it was found out that the ketone levels become quite elevated. Dr. George Cahill, that I mentioned earlier, he is the one that discovered, that during starvation, as you're losing fat, that your ketone levels increase, acetoacetate, but even more so beta hydroxybutyrate, 5 times higher than acetoacetate, and it climbs steadily, but beginning at about 24 to 48 hours after you are starving, and then it will continue to climb for 10 to 20 days and then level off, and such that ketones are providing 60% or more of the energy to your brain instead of glucose. So this is kind of where this idea then, it became recognized that ketones are an alternative fuel for the brain. This is 1967, and then all along, while anticonvulsants came in, and a lot of children responded to those. So this ketogenic diet went by the wayside, except that just a couple of centers, one of them being Johns Hopkins, that they kept up doing this diet all those years. And in 1921, there was a little boy named Charlie, and his father, Jim Abrams. He was a Hollywood director. He directed Airplane, some of the funny movies back around that time. And he had never been told about the ketogenic diet for his son. His son was on 4 or 5 different medications. He was only 20 months old. He was having up to 100 seizures a day. So these are seizures where you suddenly lose consciousness. You might not go into a full-blown tonic-clonic seizure, but maybe lose consciousness and fall. So the poor little Charlie had to wear a helmet, and his future looked grim, really. Mm-hmm. And so his father, he had gone to 5 different neurologists, and not one of them mentioned the ketogenic diet. But he happened to be in the library and one day stumbled upon it when he was reading about epilepsy and found out that Johns Hopkins was doing this. So he takes Charlie to Johns Hopkins. 4 to 5 days after he started the diet, completely stopped having seizures. And he ended up being on that diet for about 7 years, and then was completely seizure-free after that, even stopping the diet. And now he's in his 20s. He graduated from college. He works with special needs children. It's just amazing. I've gotten to meet them. And they have a conference every 2 years. The Charlie Foundation is the name of the group that will help people with a ketogenic diet. It's really an amazing group, and they've gotten centers all over the world. And they have these conferences, and now they've broadened it for ketogenic diet for cancer, for Alzheimer's, for Parkinson's, for, anti-inflammatory mechanisms of ketogenic diet. They're looking at other medical conditions that respond to ketosis.
Right.
So,
so for those of you out there listening, ketosis is basically the state that the body is in when it's using or burning fat for fuel.
Right.
And that's when you get the ketone bodies, which is mentioned, flowing in your system, and your body start to use that instead of glucose, which you get from breaking carbohydrates down, essentially.
Right.
And I think ketogenic diet is amazing. Ketosis, being ketosis, is such an amazing state to be in for these different type of diseases, because it has such a profound effect on really controlling and managing blood sugar level and anti-inflammatory type and response, and also really boost the function of the brain and the nervous system.
Right.
But for those out there who's thinking, well, I don't really have Alzheimer's, I'm not
Mhm.
epileptic. What do you say to those people?
Yeah. Well, a few things. One of them is if you get to be age 85 or higher, your chances of developing Alzheimer's are close to 50% at 85, and it climbs. It keeps climbing from there. So that's pretty bad odds. They have found that people who are at risk for Alzheimer's as early as in their 20s already are showing decreased glucose uptake in their brain. And this is a process that evolves over at least 10 to 20 years, where you don't have symptoms yet, but you are developing a problem of insulin resistance in your brain. So we don't know which of us is going to get this and which aren't. If you have a family history of it, it's more likely, especially on the mother's side. And I have it on both sides of my family, so I worry about it. And, and even in aging, there's something called age-related memory impairment that's not Alzheimer's. The company that studied the MCT oil found that even in age-related memory impairment, that there were improvements in memory from just taking MCT oil. So, there probably is, a problem with, well, there actually is. It's been documented that the elderly brain needs more alternative fuels to glucose compared to the young brain. So just for that reason, people
Right.
stave off aging. And then inflammation. Ketones are anti-inflammatory. Think of how many different medical conditions have inflammation as part of them. I mean, the real obvious ones are arthritises and rheumatoid arthritis or something like that. But people that have heart attacks, they tend to have high blood pressure, and they often have inflammation in the blood vessel walls, and that's where these clots start forming. And then you can have a heart attack. And that's from inflammation in the blood vessels, and that's not something you can see or feel, really.
Certainly.
So, yeah,
I
that's
mean,
another good reason.
I want to add to that. It's like what you were saying. It takes 20, 25 years for these disease to develop symptoms. So you might already having it. You might be on your way. And by the time the plaques start to really get to the point that you start to lose the brain function, it's already too late. It's 25 years of damage. Oh, not too late, but why wait until that long, right? And it's all
Yeah.
about optimizing the health of the cells, longevity
Yeah.
by looking at brain performance, your ability to communicate better, your ability to be in a better state of mind as well. I think those are very, very important.
Yeah. Another thing is diabetes, type 2
Oh,
diabetes
yes, big time.
especially, but even type 1 diabetes. There's a study of MCT oil that it helps, it preserves cognition and prevents symptoms of hypoglycemia. Like some people are very brittle with their diabetes and they'll have hypoglycemic episodes where their blood sugar gets very low. You can even have a seizure when that happens. And MCT oil, they found in this study, was protective of the brain, and they didn't develop these symptoms. Really cool. But type 2 diabetes, a lot of research out there, it's just piling up. Jeff Bolick, Stephen Finney, some of these other, have been studying using very low carb, high fat diet for type 2 diabetes. And people go into remission very quickly. Within 2 to 3 weeks, they often can stop insulin if they're on insulin. They can often reduce their medications, of course, with their physician's guidance, because the ketones reduce blood sugar levels, and that helps reduce insulin levels. And the insulin levels tend to be very high in type 2 diabetes. Other organs besides the brain can use ketones as a fuel. Your muscles, your heart, basically most of your organs except your liver where they're made, which makes sense. So there are all kinds of complications that you have to worry about as a diabetic. Kidney failure is a common one. Diabetic retinopathy. It's an eye disease that you can become blind from. People, the skin and their legs, just the circulation becomes very poor, and some people end up with amputations. I mean, diabetes is just a horrible disease if you have it, for years especially. And if ketones can provide this alternative fuel, there's a potential that it could keep these complications from happening. So, it's very worthwhile going on a ketogenic diet and, raising ketone levels to provide that alternative fuel. So,
Yeah, let's
another
get
statistic.
well,
Yeah.
well
Oh, yeah.
go
Oh,
ahead.
yeah. I was just going to say one more statistic
Sure.
about diabetics. If you get to age 75 in the US, 3/4 of people at 75 are either diabetic or pre-diabetic. 3/4. And if you have diabetes, you have a much higher risk than the average population of developing dementia.
Mm,
So another good
that's
reason if
scary.
you're diabetic to think keto.
Right.
Think keto.
And it takes a few weeks for ketogenic diet to really kicks in and your body starts to adapt into ketosis, and sometimes
Right.
that can be hard for a lot of people, and it takes sustained discipline in your diet to
Right.
actually get into ketosis and really reap the benefit from the ketone bodies and being in ketosis. That's why I want to shift gear and talk about the
Yeah.
exogenous ketones, which
Mhm.
are newer technologies. So,
Right.
can you explain to our listeners what exogenous ketones are and what it does to the body?
Okay. So exogenous ketones are ketones that are not made within your own body. So when you make them within your own body, they're called endogenous, which means the origins within the body. So exogenous is when you actually give the ketone body, and in this case, it's beta hydroxybutyrate. We're going to be talking about that you can raise ketone levels with regardless of what you're eating. It will raise your ketone levels. It will be even better if you eat a ketogenic diet or a low carb diet. So there's really only a few ways. Like I mentioned earlier, the ketone is too acidic itself. Beta hydroxybutyrate is too acidic to just take it like that as an acid. So it has to be attached to something, and people get very confused. Why does it have sodium in it? For example.
Mm-hmm.
So Dr. Veach's ester, as I mentioned, is connected to an alcohol to make an ester. The other way to make it is by attaching it to salts. And so the ketone salts that we're talking about, I have sodium, magnesium, calcium, and potassium, and different combinations. So the formulation has been improving and improving, and they basically were tested first and developed in the lab of Dr. Dominic D'Agostino at University of South Florida and his associates there. And they've been, the formulations have been improved. I know, I think several people are really working on that, but so that there's less sodium and more magnesium and calcium, less potassium. So they have to be salts. They either have to be a salt or an ester. There's actually a ketone product that's going to be attached where it's made into a triglyceride, which is interesting. That one's working its way down the FDA pipeline. And the ketone salts can get your levels quite a bit higher than MCT or coconut oil. And for example, just yesterday, I checked my own level. I do this every now and then, and I did before and after I had a serving of the ketone salts. And my level before was 0.7 millimoles, and that's mainly coconut. I do a lot of coconut and MCT on a low-carb diet. And then I had the ketone salt product, and it went up by 1 millimole in an hour. So it went up to 1.7, which is actually pretty significant. You can get your levels between about 0.5 and 2 millimoles, depending on who you are and what you're doing with your diet, with this product, possibly more if you're on a pretty strict ketogenic diet.
Yeah, I personally noticed major difference in my, I guess, cognitive performance.
Mm-hmm.
And basically my sleep. Those are the two major things that improve my focus, my ability to be efficient, and my ability to be present with the person right away after trying the exogenous ketones. I've been taking it pretty much daily for like 5-6 months now, and it works great with patients for really to help assist them in their dietary and lifestyle change. Maybe they can't go completely ketogenic yet, but this is just basically assisting them. Now, for those who are attempting to do a ketogenic diet and want to use exogenous ketones, and can't really completely cut out the carb and get into the full-on quote unquote ketogenic diet. Do you still think this product or exogenous ketones is beneficial for them? They still should take it anyways?
Yeah, I do. Like I think for me, my awareness has to do with the elderly population, but also, younger people, younger, healthier people. It is hard. A ketogenic diet is hard. We're used to this lifetime of eating sugar, and it's really hard. It's a very addictive thing, but it will increase your ketone levels. It will, and the benefits from it. I've been to a number of events now and talked to hundreds of people, and regardless of what diet they're on, people do report, like what you were saying, improved mental clarity and better sleep and less aches and pains.
Yes.
Less inflammation. That's a big one that you hear quite a bit. And fat burning. So people that take it, it suppresses the appetite. Ketones are known to do that, and it helps burn fat. It actually stimulates fat burning by a couple different mechanisms, directly by burning fat, and also by reducing the glucose and insulin levels. And high insulin levels puts fat on your body and keeps it there. Insulin keeps fat on your body. If you can reduce the insulin levels, there's a chance you may burn some of that fat then, and the ketones themselves directly burn fat. So there's several good reasons. If you couple that with the appetite suppression, personally, I have found it much easier to lose weight. I have my own personal experience of having lost almost 35 pounds using these salts. And that's, I started at the end of at the end of June in 2016. I had been to a couple of Prove It events to speak, and I talked to so many people that had lost 30, 40, 60 pounds, from January, the fat that they had lost. And I'm like, okay, I've had a lifelong yo-yo dieting, myself. And so I decided to try it. And I just kind of blew through this barrier I couldn't get through for several years. I lost 8 pounds the first week and 13 pounds the first month. And then I ended up losing 35 pounds. And now I kind of leveled off for a little while. I was traveling a whole lot all over the world, including Thailand.
That's awesome.
And yeah. And then, now I'm ready to go. I'm ready to lose another 25 pounds. So I'm on track and.
That's great. And also,
Yeah.
I think I want to add to that because it also helps convert white adipose tissue or white fat cells into the brown adipose tissue or brown fat, which is more active, right? So you can actually get to use it and melt it away into energy much easier than you would white.
It's thermogenic. It raises your body temperature a little bit too, which is another good thing. You use more calories if your body temperature is a little higher.
Okay, I think we're going to have to start wrapping up here. Really appreciate you coming on and sharing with us your wisdom today. You mentioned you went to Thailand for this coconut conference, international coconut conference. What you learned there?
Oh, wow. It was so amazing. I met so many wonderful people that are, most of them are involved in the coconut oil industry, but this is the first conference that they've had where they concentrated on the health benefits of coconut oil. And it was extraordinary. So that's why they invited me to speak. And then there was Dr. Ralph Martins. He's an Alzheimer researcher from Australia. He's written a review article, The Dietary Benefits, Dietary Coconut Oil for Alzheimer's Disease. It's a review of how this really could happen. Very good article. And people, there's information out there about lauric acid, that lauric acid, which is half of coconut oil, actually kills all kinds of microorganisms. It kills all kinds of bacteria, viruses, fungi like Candida, protozoa. And it's just a unique fatty acid that way. It's half of coconut oil that kills bacteria, and viruses. And it's really extraordinary. So there's just a ton of stuff to learn. I learned that the coolest thing well, it was all really neat, but the last day we went on a field trip and I got to visit 4 different coconut farms where they're producing coconut. They're plantations, where coconuts are grown, and also, farmers that farm the coconut trees bring their coconuts in to be processed. And here were people by hand, taking the peel off the coconut and carving it into getting it ready for production. It was just really amazing, and just seeing the plants and everything. The containers that they squeeze the coconut milk out of the oil out of the coconut milk, and I don't know, it was just very interesting to me, because I talk about coconut oil all the time, but I hadn't seen it firsthand in production, and that was really amazing.
Cool. And I think it should be it should be in every household's cupboard because of those properties: antimicrobial, antifungal, antiviral. Right. And everything. And I used to think that oil pooling, have you heard of that? Where you
yeah,
coconut oil in your mouth. I used to think that was kind of like, is that really working? And then when I learned about the antiviral effect or antimicrobial effect, I'm like, okay, that started to make sense. That's for cold sores in your mouth or canker sores.
Right. Yeah. And the bacteria that cause tooth decay are killed by lauric acid. And acne, the bacteria that cause acne are killed by lauric acid. Yeah. So, a lot of people use it as a skin product. They use it as a moisturizer, but it may also be, like something that you could use on your face if you have an acne problem.
Right.
It may help cut that down.
So that's awesome. I mean, I've been using it on my skin, on my scar to help with skin health as well.
Me too.
I just want to kind of touch on this last topic before we wrap up because USA Today just came out last week with a big bold headline that says coconut oil is unhealthy and it's never been healthy. And I just think that's very irresponsible because they're a huge, huge media company and it gets shared like 900,000 times on Facebook already and it's spreading.
Yeah.
What do you have to say to that? I know we've been talking about the benefits of the coconut oil all along, but what's your response to that? Because what they're saying is essentially quoting the American Heart Association and saying, well, American Heart Association or the AHA just came out and said that coconut oil is bad for you because it's full of saturated fat and it's going to make your heart die faster, essentially.
Yeah, well, I've got a lot to say about that. I'll try to say it in a few minutes. But they started saying this in 1961, and they even the news story that they just put out. It's really an article that was published in Circulation, the journal called Circulation, that people have picked on this one little tiny thing that was mentioned in the article and turned it into the AHA says coconut oil is bad. Well, the paper that they published, they used 4 core studies to come up with this advisory. And these studies were all done in the 1950s. They were done in the 1950s. They haven't used anything more recently than that. And in the 1950s, number one, they weren't even measuring LDL and HDL, cholesterol. They were measuring total cholesterol. There was an awful lot of hydrogenated fat around. And, some of the studies back then were using hydrogenated coconut oil. They weren't even using like virgin coconut oil or, good quality coconut oil. They were using hydrogenated coconut oil. And many of the diets were deficient in omega-3 fatty acids. So hydrogenated oil, any kind, can raise your cholesterol level. Omega-3 deficiency can raise your cholesterol level. There wasn't even awareness of omega-3 that it was an essential fatty acid in the 1950s. So, there was no assurance that that was in the diet. Who would have been putting omega-3 in their diet at that point deliberately? So the studies, are old, possibly flawed in that way. They were relatively small groups. 3 of the 4 studies were men only. They didn't include women. And the other thing that just kind of blew me away was that they had a little section on coconut oil, and they actually said in it there have been no clinical trials that directly looks at the effect of coconut oil on the heart. They actually stated that.
That's on the paper.
That's on the paper. And they said, however, because it's known to raise LDL, which isn't necessarily true, cholesterol, that because LDL is high in, that high LDL can cause heart disease. That's wrong too. That's not even correct. They didn't back that up with any data there, that proved that LDL actually causes heart disease. LDL increases in response to inflammation. And there are some cardiologists out there that, Dr. Stephen Sinatra, notably, that's written about this, that LDL, increases with inflammation, and it may be at the scene of the crime, but not necessarily the culprit. It may be a sign that you have inflammation.
Right.
And right. And the other thing too, the studies with coconut oil, they even have it. That what they did was there was a study that they talked about where the fatty acids were split into separate fatty acids instead of as a whole oil like coconut. And when they looked at lauric acid, it actually increased HDL, which are classically called the good cholesterol. It's not exactly cholesterol, but it packages cholesterol. But the HDL, was increased. We're talking less than 1 point. And the LDL increased less than 1 point. So say the average LDL is maybe 100 to 150. It's kind of the range that most people are in. We're talking less than 1 point. How could less than 1 point of raising LDL cause you to have a heart attack or heart disease? I mean, you can fluctuate that much in a day, a 24-hour period. So it kind of is absurd. And, but, the bottom line is it's really flawed information. And they actually come out and say, we didn't study, coconut oil and heart disease. We're just, connecting dots and saying that, that it does. There's some really cool a couple videos by Dr. David Diamond. He's a neuroscientist at University of South Florida. And he did his own research on this for his own personal reasons, but now he takes it out to the public. But it's on cholesterol and saturated fat and statins, and how, really he just analyzes in a very interesting way. He analyzes the literature that's out there and shows how they make a fraction of a percent of a difference in mortality with and without statins turn into a 24% reduction in mortality. For example, 500,000 people, in this study, and 1.5% of them actually had a cardiac event where they had a heart attack or died from heart disease. I mean, we're talking a really tiny fraction, and they, in both groups. And they looked at, it was a fraction of 1 point between the two groups and who had died and who hadn't, and they turned that into a 24% difference in mortality. I mean, 24% sounds horrible, but it was actually a fraction. I mean, nobody in either group really died from it, because we're talking 98-point-something% of the group did not have heart disease, and this was in people who were not getting statins. And then, same thing with saturated fats, a similar kind of thing that he presents. It's very good. You can find it on YouTube.
Right. And we'll link it up there on the show notes.
Yeah.
Because
and
it's misleading, the misrepresentation of the numbers of the data, and how you can actually headlines it and get away with it.
Yeah, and it's the statin companies that are doing this, that, and and he even points out in one of them, they actually had that way down in the real fine print that it was actually 24%, So he redid their graphics and showed, instead of saying, 24, one, I don't know, that it was 1%. I don't know. He did something interesting in his presentation, but so anyway.
No, that's a great response. USA Today article. So you heard it here. It's not true. Coconut oil is indeed healthy for you when consumed in the right amount. It's actually help with the brain, help improve the ketone levels and all these good things like the antimicrobial, antifungal, antiviral property that comes along with it. Not only that, it just makes, I think it makes food, enhances the taste of the food when you cook with it as well.
Yes,
Yeah.
it does.
So my question to you is, what's your best source of coconut oil? Like which brand and why?
Well, I don't really have a specific brand that I use, but I look for virgin, unrefined, virgin coconut oil, organic. I like organic. Refined, you'll get just as much elevation of ketones. I mean, some people really are on a super tight budget, and if that's the main thing you're interested in, refined coconut oil will increase your ketones too. But I happen to like the other because it's unprocessed. There are a lot of nutrients in coconut oil that may be processed out of it, if it's refined. I don't know. I have always felt like there could be something else about coconut oil that helped my husband besides just the ketone effect. There may be something else, like the lauric acid and antimicrobial, that type of thing. So I happen to like that. And the price has come down dramatically since 2008, and it's much more available. You can actually get a good quality organic virgin coconut oil for under $20 for 54 ounces of it. I mean, that's really, decent. And it used to be about $60 for that much
I
when we
remember
first
those
started.
days.
Yeah.
All right, Dr. Mary Newport. I just want to acknowledge you for doing the work by pioneering, the movement of the coconut oil and really putting the message out there, teaching people about coconut oil, ketones, exogenous ketones, and sharing your husband Steve's story. And it's compelling what really good nutrition can do to a body and how resilient the body and the brain is. So I want to acknowledge you for that, and also, lifetime of service in the medical field as well.
Thank you. And you can find me on Facebook. I have my personal Mary Newport, but also I have a Facebook page called Coconut Oil Helps Alzheimer's, Dementia, ALS, and MS. I put a lot of information on there. So, if people want more information, you can, check that out too.
What's your website again?
Oh, my website is www.coconutketones. That's KETONES.com. Some people try to put a Y in there and they can't find it, but
Right.
coconutketones.com.
And once again, we'll link all that up in the show notes. And then you'll actually get to see the pictures that Steve drew of the clocks.
Right.
And that's, when you talk about it, you don't really see it visually, but when you see it, you see a drastic improvement, and that's going to blow your mind. So definitely check that out. Mary, the name of the show is called The Wellness Cafe. What does wellness mean to you?
Oh, gosh. Wellness to me is being 65, which I am, and having, maintaining that mental clarity, sleeping well, feeling great, not having high blood pressure, no aches and pains. It's really just, living your life in such a way that you don't have to deal with like chronic medical conditions and, these things that people expect to happen to them as they age. You don't have to have all of this happen to you. And so wellness is really a state of physical and mental well-being, I believe.
Thank you.
You're welcome.